these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Sit Rep number 5, Just the News, where you can come for just the news and be informed on your way to work. So I hope y'all are liking this kind of podcast. Let's start with the news of this week. Of course, we've seen a lot on Senate confirmation hearings. I think the most fiery of which was, of course, President Trump's nomination for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Now, Pete Hegseth is current Fox News host, currently in National Guard, a former member of the armed services, of course, and come under a lot of fire for past supposed scandals and drinking, and he took a lot of heat from Democrats on that. They tried to target him for lack of experience, lack of leading large organizations. Of course, on the Republican side, what we would say, and I have personally said, look, we need someone who will shake things up. We need someone who wants the Department of Defense to be a war-fighting machine, which is ultimately what Pete Hegseth's philosophy is. Make the Department of Defense a true war-fighting machine. He's debunked some of the claims made against him that he wouldn't want women to serve in combat. He has said, look, what I mean by that is there should be exact standards that are not gender, that have nothing to do with gender. It should be one standard to go into a combat position. Personally, from my experience, I agree with that position. If you want to be a Navy SEAL, and by the way, women can apply to be Navy SEALs, but the standard is the standard. It does not change whether you're female or male. That is Pete Hegseth's position as well. So that was a fiery one. He took some interesting questions. I thought the most disingenuous. Well, there was probably a lot of disingenuous ones, but one came from also a veteran and wounded veteran herself, Senator Tammy Duckworth. But she asked, a gotcha question, right? She would ask questions like, do you know how many countries are in the ASEAN alliance and what agreements we have with each of them? This is a disingenuous question. I know a lot about foreign affairs and the military, and I wouldn't exactly know how to answer that right off the top of my head. It's like, hey, why don't I hold a jar up of bullets? And can you tell me how many bullets are in here? No, well, then you're not qualified to be Secretary of Defense. It's ridiculous. Moving on, we had Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, a little bit smoother, obviously comes from the Senate, so has that collegial relationship with them, a huge amount of experience in Latin America. I think that's important considering, in my personal opinion, how much we need to reshift our diplomatic focus to Latin America as a whole. And Pam Bondi, former Attorney General for Florida, up for Attorney General. They all face intense questioning from Democrats, and I think the general consensus is that they will go through the nomination process, but probably mostly along party line votes. We don't know when those actual votes will be. In other news, what did we vote on in the House today? What is the U.S. House doing for you, the people? Well, we voted on the Protecting Women and Girls in Sports Act. This has obviously been a issue that we've talked about and voted on many times in the past. This particular bill requires colleges to base Title IX compliance on biological sex. This is a pretty common sense piece of legislation, and it would ensure fairness in women's sports. Now, it faced almost universal Democrat opposition. I can't tell you why, but two Texas Democrats did break ranks. That's Representatives Vicente Gonzalez and Henry Cuellar, who voted with Republicans on that. Now, a little background, why do we need to pass this in the first place? In 2023, the Biden Department of Education put out a Title IX rule that would rescind funding from colleges that ban biological males from competing in women's sports. So they took the first move here. House Republicans then passed the same bill as this one, both 0 Democrats voting in favor, but it stalled in the Senate when Senate Democrat Majority Leader Chuck Schumer refused to bring it up for a vote. Even after Democrats got walloped at the ballot box in November, acknowledging that some of it was due to this kind of DEI woke issues, for some reason, most of them are still not voting for common sense legislation. In other news, you've been hearing about the absolute devastation in Los Angeles. The wildfires have killed at least 25 people, destroyed more than 12,000 buildings since the fire started last week. Santa Ana winds, which are strong, hot, dry winds that have pretty dramatic effects on the weather. They often drive these wildfires. have died down. So firefighters are starting to make gains in containing those fires. Now, there's been a lot of controversy that's swirled over LA Fire Department's capability and the LA Mayor, Karen Bass, and the California Governor, Gavin Newsom's management of the catastrophe. Bass and other local officials have drawn criticism for cutting more than $17 million for the LA Fire Department, as well as focusing on DEI initiatives so that the fire department was more reflective of the population rather than capable of fighting fires. Newsom has been criticized for poor forest and water management, as well as price controls on property insurance that have forced many companies to cancel coverage in the area. This, of course, makes life hard on firefighters. Failure to adequately manage forests and refill water reservoirs have made the situation for firefighters way more difficult than it has to be. And you can't blame climate change. You can't blame drought. They've been out of a drought since 2022. Look, I lived in California for 10 years. It's not that they don't get enough rain. It's that they don't keep the rain that they do get. They let it go off into the ocean, and there's just poor water management all around. And our poor firefighters who are heroically battling the flames are left to deal with the consequences. And of course, the citizens are left to deal with the consequences. From the congressional side, you're going to expect a large supplemental package, just like we had recently passed for the disasters in Florida, North Carolina, et cetera, for recent hurricanes. And that will, of course, come up probably in future appropriations bills and will be part of whatever negotiation we do here in the House and the Senate. On global news, Israel and Hamas agree to a hostage deal and ceasefire. So yesterday, a three-phase hostage deal between Israel and Hamas was announced. This deal takes effect Sunday, January 19th. It stops the fighting for 42 days, freeing the 33 remaining Israeli hostages in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. The first phase of this deal will free American hostages and return them home to the U.S. Israeli troops will complete a phased withdrawal from Gaza and establish a buffer zone. Gazans will return, and humanitarian aid to Gaza will increase. Although the deal was negotiated under Biden, the Trump team will ensure implementation, and I believe they were also involved in the negotiation. Now, let's recall Trump promised there would be hell to pay if the hostages weren't released before he took office. So you can interpret that any number of ways, but it is possible to interpret it in the following way, which was that threat is what perhaps accelerated the ability to create a deal. Whether that's a good deal or not, I'm not so sure from the American perspective. I think that's more of a question for Israelis. Do Israelis think that's a good deal? You do need to cease fire at some point, but it is also unacceptable to Israelis, and I think to American interests as well, that Hamas can never remain in power. Final details still being worked out, but this deal would take effect Sunday, the day before Trump takes office. Now, of course, there's off-ramps for this deal. Key to Israel is ensuring that Hamas sticks to any deal that they signed, and now you have a new American president who is really ready to, as he said, bring hell to them if they back away from the deal, if they try to rearm, recruit more militants, or siphon off humanitarian aid meant for Gazan citizens. The U.S. can and should back Israel in hitting the brakes on this deal, and it's pretty obvious at this point that Israel has the full capacity and capability to take on Hamas from a military operation perspective. Moving back into the Western Hemisphere, Cuba has been removed from state sponsor of terrorism list by the Biden administration. They announced the removal of Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. This rolls back economic sanctions and bans on foreign assistance put in place during the first Trump administration. Cuba was first placed on the list 42 years ago for their support of communist guerrillas and terrorists. This rolls back the sanctions that they put in place under Trump's first administration. Obama removed them in 2015. Trump put them back in 2021 because they continued support of terrorists and socialist authoritarians in Latin America. By the way, of course, they're still doing this. They have tight control over the Venezuelan government, of course, which recently held faux elections and have a lot of Cuban intelligence integrated into their government. The Cuban government announced it would release over 500 political prisoners as a result. Once he takes office, Trump could relist them as he did before and re-implement sanctions. It is also likely that you're going to see a lot of support for Cuban sanctions by Cuban Americans and Cuban Americans who serve in Congress. And real quick background, if you're super curious, what does the SST do? What does being on this state-sponsored of terrorism list actually mean? It means that you are pursuant to 3 laws: Section 6J of the Export Administration Act, the Arms Export Control Act, and the Foreign Assistance Act. This results in economic sanctions, restrictions on U.S. foreign assistance, a ban on defense export and sales, certain control over exports of dual-use items, miscellaneous financial and other restrictions. It implicates other sanction laws that penalize persons and countries engaging in certain trade with state sponsors. Look, basically it means there's harm to your economy for the most part. It's not good for you. But of course, Cuba and other countries like it, Iran, Venezuela, they have become experts at getting around a lot of these issues. So it's really a matter of who's in charge in our country and which administration is in charge, on how hard we want to be on them and how much we think that is forcing the change that we want to see. I will say this. Cuba is at a tipping point. People have been saying that for decades and decades and decades, but the economy now is worse than it has ever been. I would say now is not the time to let off pressure. So we will see what the Trump administration does. My guess, if I'm going to guess, it's likely that they go back to their original policy, which was to keep those sanctions in place. Now moving back into the United States here, the TikTok ban and Red Note. What is Red Note? So as the TikTok clock winds down to 0, the app's users are moving on to new platforms. And the Supreme Court is yet to rule on the constitutionality of the TikTok ban, which is set to come into force on January 19th. TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, is prepared to shut down the app on Sunday. ByteDance is located in China, by the way. And if you're located in China, you have to listen to what the Chinese Communist Party tells you, which is why we wanted to ban TikTok in the first place, or at least allow it to be purchased by American buyers. No American buyers have done that yet. Now, the Supreme Court declined the option to pause the shutdown order until they reach a temporary ruling. That means if TikTok isn't sold before Sunday for between $60 and $100 billion is what the estimated worth, depending on how you look at the app, it'll be removed from the App Store. Regarding a sale, doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of progress from prospective buyers. In other news related to yours truly, wrote an op-ed. If you read nothing else, it's on Fox News online. 80,000 American lives a year, the case for a congressional war on cartels. This is my op-ed outlining some of our work that we've done over the past year on the cartel task force. Dozens and dozens of meetings, 8 trips across the country, meeting with every agency there is, 2 trips to Mexico. I've learned a lot. And look, some of our assumptions about this problem are right, but a lot are wrong. One thing we do know for sure is that President Trump wants to focus on this, and I think the Congress should focus on it as well. One of the ways you do that is by creating a select committee. You create a select committee. For instance, we had a select committee on China. The Democrats would create a select committee on climate change. I think we need a select committee on cartels. Why? Because a select committee centralizes jurisdiction. We can come up with a bunch of different pieces of legislation, but they go across multiple committees of jurisdiction. It makes it very hard to pass comprehensive legislation. Also, in our task force, really, it's just a bunch of members who meet and try to do some work, but we have no staffing resources. We have no budget. A select committee would, and we could flesh out some of these solutions in a much more coherent way. And so my press to the speaker to create this select committee continues. More on that later. That's all for today. Thank you.